In this video, we're going to look at how we move substances from the tubule of the nephron, the individual smallest unit of the kidney, and we're going to look at how we move those substances back into the bloodstream. So substances are going to move either between the epithelial cells in the nephron, and that is called paracellular transport, or substances will move through the epithelial cells, and that is called transcellular transport. So let's have a look at this diagram. Over here we can see the glomerulus, which is the ball of capillaries. The blood is moving into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole. So the renal artery branches off into these afferent arterioles that go to each individual nephron. Now, when we move fluid and ions from these glomerular capillaries into the Bowman's capsule, that process is filtration. Now, everything that is now in this nephron tubule is called filtrate. In this filtrate, it contains all kinds of water and nutrients and ions that we don't necessarily want to excrete. We need to move a lot of these substances back into the bloodstream. And that is this process here called reabsorption. After the blood moves from the glomerular capillaries, it's going to come back out through efferent arterioles. So these are still carrying oxygen, and these vessels are going to form the peritubular capillaries that surround all of the nephron. And then every location in the whole nephron where substances are moving from the tubule into the blood, that is reabsorption. Now, when we zoom into that section, we can see here, this is our tubule of our nephron, and it's made up of these epithelial cells. The epithelial cells contain tight junctions. So there are proteins in here that form a barrier. And this is to prevent all kinds of substances from moving out of the nephron that shouldn't. We need this process to be highly regulated so that only water really can move in between the epithelial cells. Everything else, like our ions, so sodium ions and our glucose molecules, those substances have to go through the epithelial cells. And they're going to go through these epithelial cells with membrane proteins. There's proteins on these membranes that help to transport substances. Now, in previous videos, we've talked about facilitated transport before. Facilitated transport means that there's a membrane protein that helps the substance to cross the membrane. Those proteins can be carrier proteins that carry glucose molecules. They can be ion channels for potassium. They could also be co-transporters, where sodium and some other substance can move across the membrane at the same time. And then we use the sodium gradient as a type of energy. So when we use these membrane transport proteins, it's facilitated diffusion. Now, water can use a membrane protein. That membrane protein is called an aquaporin. But water can also move through the cells like osmosis, and it can move between the cells, and that will also be driven by ion gradients. So remember, water is attracted to charged molecules or polar molecules that have a slight charge. So sodium ions, for example, have a positive charge. If we have more sodium moving across the membrane, more water is going to want to follow that sodium. So if we are reabsorbing sodium, then we're going to reabsorb more water. And if our sodium levels are lower, then we're going to reabsorb less water. Now, this is important because remember the main functions of the kidneys. One of the main functions is to regulate blood pressure. And blood pressure is dependent on blood volume. So our kidneys play a really, really important role in regulating our blood pressure because it regulates how much water and ions are being reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So when our blood pressure is high, then we need to excrete more. And when our blood pressure is low, then we need to reabsorb more. Now, in this diagram, there's a few terms that I want to point out. One is the apical membrane, which is on the side of the lumen. So this is the tubule. This is our nephron, where we have the filtrate. And then over here, this is our basolateral membrane, which is on kind of the outside. And our capillary, our peritubular capillary, is going to be on this side. So when we reabsorb substances, it's going to move into the bloodstream. Now, if we look at water first, water can move from the lumen of the tubule back into the bloodstream in 3 different ways. First, it can diffuse across the membrane, or really, like we usually think of this as osmosis. Water can move across the membrane and it does not need a membrane protein. It simply moves across the membrane because of the concentration of charged molecules, for example, sodium ions. So anything that has a charge is going to pull water into these epithelial cells, which will then move out and go into the blood. We can use membrane proteins to move extra water, and those proteins that move water are called aquaporins. So aqua means water, and porins is like a pore or a hole or opening. And then water can also move in between cells through paracellular transport. And again, there are tight junctions in here that will prevent the movement of other molecules like ions or glucose or amino acids. But water can move through here, and again, because of an osmotic gradient. So there are 3 ways that we can move water. We will look at the hormones shortly, but ADH is anti-diuretic hormone. When this hormone is produced, it stimulates the production of these membrane proteins so that we can reabsorb more water. When we move glucose or amino acids, we are going to use the co-transport system. So the co-transport system is going to use sodium ions. We always have a higher concentration of sodium outside the cell, and this gradient can be used for energy. So as sodium moves into the cell, it's going to also bring with it a glucose or an amino acid. So on the apical membrane, we move these nutrients through co-transport. And then on the opposite side, on the basolateral membrane, we have sodium-potassium pumps. And this is to prevent a buildup of sodium from occurring in the cell. So as sodium moves in, it's going to be pumped out on the basolateral side. And then on the basolateral side, we have glucose carrier proteins that will move the glucose out of the cell so that it can then go into the bloodstream. Now, while we're talking about glucose, I want to talk about the situation where somebody has diabetes or pre-diabetes even, where there's elevated blood sugar. So blood glucose levels, when we filter the blood in the kidney, in that nephron, we move everything from the blood. It's not sorted or organized in the filtration process. It's only organized when we move it back in so that we can be regulated. If you have a lot of glucose going into the filtrate, those sodium co-transporters and the glucose transporters, they will essentially get full in a way. They can become saturated so that it can't keep moving all of the glucose in. Now, in the proximal tubule, the very first part of the nephron, we should be moving all of our glucose from that filtrate back into the bloodstream. But if there's too much glucose, those carrier proteins can't bring it all back. That means some glucose is going to stay in the filtrate. Now, glucose has an oxygen-hydrogen hydroxyl group that is a polar bond. Because glucose is polar, it is attracted to water. So when we have high amounts of glucose in the filtrate, that is going to hold on to water. It's going to act like an osmotic gradient. So that means you're going to reabsorb less water back into the blood. It's going to stay in the filtrate with the glucose. That means you're going to excrete more. So people with diabetes, untreated diabetes, or high blood sugar that's not treated with a medication, then that high blood sugar is going to cause increased excretion. So people will urinate more. And then one of the other primary symptoms is increased thirst. So if you're peeing all the time and you're very thirsty And usually the urine, when there's a lot of glucose in it, it has a fruity, sweet kind of smell. Then you know you have blood sugar regulation problems. Now I want to look at how do we regulate this process? How does the nephron know how much water to reabsorb and how much sodium ions to reabsorb so that we can maintain blood pressure? So remember way back in other videos when we looked at a negative feedback loop. We have a stimulus, we have receptors that detect that stimulus, we have an integrating center that looks at the set point and then the stimulus information and then has an effect. Okay, so one of the main things that the kidneys do is they regulate blood pressure. Now, the kidney, in order to be able to have an effect, it has to detect that sensory information. So let's first just look at blood pressure. Let's suppose our blood pressure is low. Okay, you haven't had a glass of water in a while, or you were outside in the sun sweating, or you were exercising and sweating and breathing off water, and now your blood pressure is a little bit lower because your blood volume is a little bit lower. Okay, we're not talking about a disease state, we're still in homeostasis. So when your blood pressure drops a little bit, then our body is going to try to hold on to more water. You're not going to keep excreting the same amount if your blood volume is too low. So how do we detect that? We have two sets of cells that are really important here. One is called the juxtaglomerular cells. When those juxtaglomerular cells are surrounding the arteriole, they are baroreceptors, they're stretch receptors. They can detect how much that arteriole is stretching. So when blood pressure is high, it's going to stretch more. When blood pressure is low, it's not going to be stretching as much. So remember, the afferent arteriole is bringing blood into the glomerular capillaries. So let's suppose our blood pressure is low. That stretch signal is going to be decreased, and the juxtaglomerular cells will detect that. The other cells that are important are the macula densa cells. Now, they are cells that have chemoreceptors that will detect, or osmoreceptors that will detect ions like sodium. And so those macula densa cells are located in the upper portion of the ascending loop of Henle right before it reaches that distal tubule. Let's just quickly have a look here. So our afferent arteriole is surrounded by these smooth muscle cells, and then we have specialized smooth muscle cells called the juxtaglomerular cells. These will detect the change in blood pressure because when blood pressure is increased, these are going to be stretching. When it's decreased, they will not be stretching. And then we have our macula densa cells here, which are part of the tubule, and they will be detecting the osmotic balance. Now, let's suppose we have low blood pressure. You haven't had a glass of water in a while. There's going to be decreased stretch in those baroreceptors in that afferent arteriole, also a little bit in the efferent, but primarily the afferent, where the blood is coming in. And that is going to trigger the juxtaglomerular cells. Now, one of the substances, one of the effects of this negative feedback system is that the juxtaglomerular cells will produce this molecule called renin. Renin is part of the Renin-Angiotensin system, or the RAS, and we're going to look in detail about how that system works. Another example I want to show you though is, let's suppose we have low sodium levels. So sodium ions, that concentration is detected by the macula densa cells. And then a couple of things happen. When your sodium is low, your water is also generally low. So if we need to reabsorb more sodium, then we're going to also reabsorb more water. So this can occur when our blood pressure is low as well, because remember that water and ions are very connected. So when the macula densa cells detect this low sodium, it is going to signal the arterioles, and it will also signal the juxtaglomerular cells. Now, we've just talked about how the juxtaglomerular cells will produce renin, and this is going to have a whole cascade of effects that I'll talk about in a second. But the other thing that we can do to control the amount of blood going into the nephron, which means we're controlling filtration and then therefore controlling the amount that we're excreting, is we can dilate and constrict arterioles. And when we constrict the arteriole, we are going to decrease the glomerular filtration rate. And I talked about this in the previous video. If we dilate the arterioles, then more blood is going to go into the nephron, into the glomerulus, and we will increase the filtration rate. So when we want to reabsorb sodium and water, we want to increase our blood pressure, and when we want to decrease the blood pressure, then we're going to excrete more water and ions. So they go hand in hand. So now let's look at how the renin-angiotensin system works. Now the kidney has produced this renin molecule because we have low blood pressure. So that means we have to have some hormones produced that are going to tell the kidney to reabsorb more water, so moving it from the filtrate back into the blood. So how does that happen? There's different stimuli that will trigger this cascade of events. One, if our blood pressure is low because our blood volume is low. Our sodium ion concentration is low, which usually often correlates with low blood volume. Or we have an increased sympathetic nervous system response. This is our stress response. So when we have stress, whether it's physical or emotional, we want to increase our blood pressure. So all of these stimuli are going to lead to an increase in blood pressure. The renin molecule is produced by the juxtaglomerular cells in the kidney. Now we have another molecule that is always in our circulatory system, and it is produced by the liver. That molecule is called angiotensinogen. When angiotensinogen is circulating around in the blood and then renin is produced, renin will cleave this molecule. Renin is an enzyme. It creates this molecule called angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin 1 then has to be cleaved again and converted into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, is an enzyme that will target angiotensin 1 to produce angiotensin 2. There are some medications called ACE inhibitors that will block this process, and then the process doesn't continue. And these medications would be used to decrease blood pressure. Because remember, this pathway, the whole goal is to increase blood pressure. When we produce angiotensin 2, there are multiple things that happen. First, we are going to stimulate the production of aldosterone. Aldosterone is made in the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone tells the nephron to increase sodium reabsorption. When we increase sodium reabsorption, we are going to increase water reabsorption, and then that means we will increase our blood volume, which will increase our blood pressure. The other way that we can increase our blood pressure is by constricting blood vessels. Angiotensin 2 can also cause arterioles and other blood vessels to constrict. When we constrict blood vessels all over the body, we are going to increase our overall blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 also tells the kidney to reabsorb more water and sodium. The other thing that's interesting is when we're reabsorbing more sodium, we are excreting more potassium. And then we also have the pituitary gland. So angiotensin 2 can signal the pituitary gland to secrete antidiuretic hormone. And then the last thing is that the hypothalamus, which is producing the antidiuretic hormone, this is also going to make us thirsty. So all of those effects will lead to an increase in blood pressure. Either we're going to increase blood volume by reabsorbing sodium and water, or we'll constrict the blood vessels, so that increases the pressure, and we'll also feel thirsty, so we'll drink more water. And then when we drink if you drink a lot of water, then your blood pressure is going to be a little bit elevated. And then in a little while, after that gets into your bloodstream, then you're going to excrete more water. And then we have to drink enough water multiple times during the day so that we're always keeping our blood volume regulated and our ion concentration regulated. So the hormones that we've looked at so far, one is antidiuretic hormone. That is made by the hypothalamus, and then we store it in the posterior pituitary gland. And this is one of the posterior pituitary hormones that we talked about before. The other one is oxytocin. So ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, will be released when the hypothalamus gets that angiotensin 2 signal, or when itself detects low blood pressure. And then antidiuretic hormone tells the kidney to reabsorb water. And it does that by telling the nephron to produce aquaporins. And then we talked about aldosterone. Aldosterone is made in the adrenal cortex, and it tells the kidney, the nephron, to basically reabsorb sodium. When we reabsorb sodium, we're going to also reabsorb water. So then that also has the effect of increasing blood pressure. And then we have parathyroid hormone is another hormone that is important because it tells the kidney to reabsorb calcium. And I've talked about that in a previous video. The link is below if you want a refresher on the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid hormone is about regulating blood calcium levels. And it also tells the kidney to reabsorb magnesium. Those are very important minerals for all kinds of homeostatic processes. And the last hormone that I want to mention is atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. And this is produced in the atria of the heart. Now, when your blood pressure is high, this is going to stimulate atrial natriuretic peptide. And that is going to tell the kidneys to excrete water. Because when your blood pressure is high, we need to decrease blood volume to decrease blood pressure. I have a summary chart that I'll show you in a second that will summarize those hormones. But first, I want to talk about what is a diuretic. A diuretic is something that makes you excrete more water. You're going to pee more. So a diuretic basically blocks either the hormones or those membrane proteins that are allowing the reabsorption. So when we decrease the reabsorption, we're going to increase excretion, and then we urinate more. So an example of something that is a diuretic is alcohol. Alcohol actually acts like a diuretic because it inhibits the production of antidiuretic hormone. So when you're not producing antidiuretic hormone, you're not getting that last little bit of reabsorption in the distal tubule and the collecting duct. That's where most of the hormones are acting at the very end of the nephron. So when antidiuretic hormone can't produce aquaporins, then you're going to pee more. So alcohol actually acts like a diuretic. Now, another one that people think is a diuretic is caffeine. And caffeine is not technically a diuretic. You do pee more, but it's for a different reason. You don't pee more volume. You just actually go to the bathroom more frequently because caffeine makes your bladder more sensitive to stretching. So you can't hold as much in your bladder at one time. So if you drink a lot of coffee, you're going to the bathroom more, partly because you're consuming liquids, and partly because your bladder is more sensitive to being stretched. So here is a summary chart for the hormones that affect kidney reabsorption.